In the travel folders, it was said, the Pacific is an ocean of magnificent distances. The largest ocean in the world, 34 times bigger than the continent of Europe. It covers 70 million square miles, roughly 1/3 of the Earth's surface. In 1941, the fastest luxury liner took 5 days to make its landfall at Honolulu, first port of call on the voyage to Yokohama, over 3,000 miles and 9 days further away. Of course, if you were in a great hurry, like Japan's special envoy, Saburo Kurosu, in December 1941, you could make the trip by air in 2 days, 13 hours, and 15 minutes. The Pacific is an ocean of many moods. To the north, the Aleutian winds are icy and unpredictable. Here, it is said, weather is born. To the south, in equatorial heat, the sunsets are of unparalleled beauty. Here, rising from the blue shark-infested waters, lie jungles, dense and malarial. Volcanoes, like Krakatoa, which once exploded with a violence that shook the world. It is an ocean of islands with names once strange to Western ears. Tarawa, Saipan, Iwo Jima. Names now almost as familiar as Gettysburg, Trafalgar, Verdun. Islands inhabited by little-known peoples, Polynesians, Melanesians, and Micronesians. We had caught glimpses of them in the movies, dancing their hip dances, chanting their island songs. At one time, some had been cannibals, but now most were good-natured and friendly, living in what writers like Herman Melville and Jack London had described as an approximation of paradise. Since 6:55 a.m. Honolulu time, Sunday, December 7th, 1941, this paradise has been a battlefield. The Pacific Ocean is the biggest, the strangest, the most complex battlefield in history. To understand what distance in the Pacific really means, touch the point of a pencil to the map. Under this tiny point may be arrayed all the ships of the United States Navy in battle formation. Yet, these ships must be so disposed and so employed as to exert an influence and control over the whole Pacific area. Land war is familiar to the people of Europe and Asia. A massive war of tanks locked in battle, of men deploying, maneuvering along highways, canals, railroads, in city streets, in buildings of brick and stone. But it is different in the Pacific, where there are no highways, no railroads, only the limitless lanes of the sea. Along these lanes, stretching thousands of miles to bases on fighting fronts in every corner of the Pacific, the war must be carried to the enemy by ship, by what has been and will continue to be the greatest concentration of shipping in history. There is a special kind of ship for every mission. This is the battleship, known to the men of the fleet as the battle wagon, a floating fortress belted with armor plate, 16-inch guns 50 feet long, which can hurl their projectiles into a bullseye 20 miles away. Light and heavy cruisers, scouts and watchdogs, fast and elusive, able to hold their own in the heaviest actions. The destroyer, the tin can, a fragile steel shell crammed with horsepower, moving at express train speed to protect slower vessels with guns, torpedoes, and depth charges. The submarine, the lone prowler, operating for as much as 60 days in enemy waters, thousands of miles from its base. The aircraft carrier, the flat top, backbone of the fleet today. A floating airport as big as 3 football fields laid end to end. A huge and complicated mechanism able to hurl 100 planes into battle across the horizon. Following the fighting ships are the indispensable ships of the train, repair ships, tankers, transports. With landing craft, they carry the fuel, ammunition, machine shops, food and drinking water, everything to enable the fighting ships to stay at sea farther from their bases and in more continuous action than any fleet in history. The fighting ships and their auxiliaries are arranged in groups called task forces, a new concept developed in peacetime years by the United States Navy and proved in battle in this war. Each task force is in itself a fleet, self-contained and self-sustaining, a singular mission, convoy, reconnaissance, or attack. And as the task force principle is new, almost all the ships themselves are new, built and commissioned since war began. Their officers and men have carried the war to the very doorstep of Japan. They too are new. Only a few years ago, most of these young veterans were at home, playing football and baseball, studying at schools, working in factories or on farms, growing up in the dream that war had been outlawed in their time. While they were growing up in the 20s and 30s, scores of American warships lay deserted and unmanned, gathering rust in quiet harbors. Others, half finished, had been sold for scrap or sent to the bottom of the sea. This was the result of deliberate policy. Peace through disarmament was the spirit which moved the Washington Arms Conference of 1922 and the London Conference of 1930. Statesmen of those days, with the best of intentions, had forgotten the words of the anonymous admiral of 1918. The means to wage war must be kept in the hands of those who hate war. In America's case, geography was an additional factor. She was 6,000 miles from danger in the west, 3,000 in the east. Most Americans came to believe that a comparatively small navy was protection enough for their isolated seacoasts. But in the middle 30s, events in Europe and Asia began to change America's thinking. She began to prepare to throw her weight into the world's struggle against fascism and aggression. And by September 1939, whatever remained of her old complacency was gone for good. In quick succession, Congress passed the Lend-Lease Act, which made America, in fact, the arsenal of democracy. The so-called Two-Ocean Navy Bill. The United States Navy was reborn. The Selective Service Act, to mobilize the nation's young manhood. But time was running short. It ran out on what began as just another American Sunday.